welcome to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Welcome to a new year, 2015, new episode, but we're going to be talking about a unfortunately old issue that's been happening in America today. We're going to talk about homelessness. And unfortunately, this is a problem that is very much within our reach to solve, and we're going to kind of find some ways to do the work that needs to be done. But just to kind of give you guys a quick rundown on some of the facts when it comes to homelessness. Let's look at a couple of of just sort of like where the facts and figures and numbers are. Okay, so on any given night in America, 600,000 of our fellow Americans are without permanent shelter. 138,000 of those are children. Okay. 57,000 of that 600,000 are veterans. These are men and women who serve their country, the richest country in the world, and have been literally left out in the cold. Causes of homeless in America include the plain and simple fact that worsening inequality has made it harder and harder to afford rent in many places across the country. Another cause is domestic violence and other forms of abuse, which, depending on what surveys you look at, is the cause of 90% of women, teenagers, children for being homeless. 5 million homes were foreclosed upon, and the lack of a social safety net to provide access to affordable housing has left many homeless in the last 8 years. And despite all of this, we have many cities, states, and the federal government simply not doing enough. In fact, there are some city councils that are criminalizing the homeless, and they are making it illegal and a criminal act to sleep in public, to sleep in your own car, to loiter. It's that loitering is being treated as if it were a threat to public safety. But the interesting thing is that, you don't have to worry if you are doing this outside of the Apple Store or Best Buy, and it's Black Friday. That won't get you in trouble. But if you're just trying to survive and make it through one more night, you will be in trouble with some cities across the country with homelessness and the way it's being criminalized. To help us humanize some of these facts a little bit more, I'm really, really glad to introduce our special guest for this first segment of the show, Eric Jonathan Sheptock. He has been known as the homeless advocate. He has been an amazing, amazing voice for struggling families in Washington, D.C. for almost 10 years. The D.C. City Council recently honored his service by making December 31st, 2014, Eric Jonathan Sheptock Day. And we thank you very much for being on the show, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So, Eric, you got to hear some of the facts that I opened the show with. And what I guess I'm kind of curious about is, one of the other facts that we're dealing with today is that it is snowing in Washington, D.C. The original forecast called for something like a half inch of snow. That quickly kind of got rewritten, and because the snow kept falling. Now, for many people, that's just kind of a snow day from school or work, but it poses a very different challenge if you're struggling with shelter. I was wondering if you can give us an idea of what a day like today is like for our homeless fellow Americans.
Well, fortunately, here in D.C., we do have a right to shelter if the temperature, including the heat index or the wind chill factor, is 32 and below or 95 and above. If it's between 33 and 94, then you don't have a right to shelter. It doesn't matter if it's raining, doesn't matter if it's a storm. Every so often you can count on the good graces of the shelter employees to let you in if it's a really bad rain. But you don't have a right to shelter in extreme weather. It's all just based on the temperature, and the advocates have really been fighting against that to try to make it where any extreme weather would be reason to keep the shelter open.
Right, because I mean, just a few years ago, Superstorm Sandy, I mean, that was an extreme weather event. But I don't recall the temperatures, at least in this part of the country. I don't recall the temperatures, falling below or above those thresholds that you were talking about. So, how do families deal with those kinds of situations?
Well, in terms of the weather, the families actually have the easiest time, only because once they're in the family shelter, that they can stay in. They don't get put out. But the homeless individuals, as soon as it gets above 32 degrees, the shelter can be closed if it's between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Well, the families a few years ago, that they actually did get put out when it got to 33. That was a really terrible thing, because you had parents with 6-month-old babies, and when it got up to 33 degrees, if you were in the overflow part of the shelter, you got put out. The ones who have the actual apartment style units in the family shelter could stay, but the ones who were sleeping on the dining room floor, because there was no rooms left, actually had to leave. And I felt really badly that it gets to be 33, 34 degrees, and you got a tiny baby less than a year old, and you have to walk out into the weather, because it's above freezing.
Yeah. So now you've actually, you've actually borne witness to this yourself, and I was wondering if you could, tell us more about that experience, because I think eyewitness is the most important testimony we have on these issues.
Yeah. Well, I should say that I'm an indoor homeless person. I actually do stay inside of a shelter, but I have stepped outside, just not in a while. But in April of last year, there was a late freeze around April 15th, I believe it was, and so on the morning of April 16th, I was contacted by a relatively new news lady who was working for Channel 7, who had been referred to me by Sam Ford, and they were asking me about these two guys that actually froze by I-295 here in Southeast. And what happens is that many of the homeless, especially those who stay outdoors, don't get the news. And so if we do get something like a late freeze, then they don't know it's coming, and they stay out in the elements, and then we find them dead. We count the homeless every year, and we also have a ceremony for the homeless who died every year. So we had the ceremony for those who died last month, and then this month, in about 2 weeks, we'll be counting the homeless. And so in January of 2013, we counted 6,859 homeless people. In January of 14, we counted 7,748. That's an increase of 889, or 13%. And I was upset by the immediate response from D.C. government. They actually said very little about it. They weren't appalled by it, but I was.
How did they? What was their explanation for? For that increase. Because there are. That's clearly a failure of our basic city civic services. But there are other factors that must have, led to that increase. So how did they respond when they were questioned about it?
Well, that's just it. They actually didn't respond. See, every 2 months we have in D.C. what's called the Interagency Council on Homelessness meeting, the ICH. And that's where people from different departments of D.C. government come together to talk about what they're doing to end homelessness. And normally, after the count is done in January, the numbers are issued, or I should say published, around May. And at the following ICH meeting in June, we would talk about the reason for the increase or the decrease. But this past June, they didn't do that. And that's what I meant when I said that there was a immediate response, because I brought it up, and I said, why didn't you talk about this at the meeting? And the ones who I confronted about that, who normally do the report out, said we weren't asked to. And I thought that was kind of fishy.
Yeah.
You get this 13% increase in homelessness, and you got all these people that get paid $100,000 a year to try to end it, and we have this 10-year plan that failed, and nobody is saying anything. And I should also say, you mentioned Eric Jonathan Sheptock Day. Well, the irony or the coincidence is that in 2004, D.C. government had a 10-year plan to end homelessness. In 2007, they scrapped it because they weren't meeting benchmarks. But if it had continued, it would have ended homelessness on or by the last day of 2014,
14,
which is the day they gave me.
Yeah, yeah. So what were some of those milestones that? I mean, you said that they were meeting some milestones but not meeting others. So what were some of the milestones that got met?
Well, no. Actually, I said they weren't meeting any milestones.
Any? Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
and so actually, that's about the time that I began advocating. They made the plan in '04. I came to DC in '05. Actually, I'm not from DC. And in '06, I began advocating for the homeless. And then in '07, they scrapped the plan. And I don't really have the facts as to what benchmarks they weren't meeting. I just found what I could online about that issue, and no one's talking about it. No one's talking about why they scrapped the plan or what failed. And DC government is really bad, when it comes to that. They don't talk about their failures. Then if you don't talk about your failures, you can't fix them.
Right.
And so that's part of what we end up with. And in recent months, I've even said, we should talk about what failed and why it failed. And I've been called a pessimist when I said that. To me, it's not being a pessimist, it's being a planner.
Right, right. I mean, if anything, it's being a realist.
Yes, exactly.
And so, I mean, from a realist viewpoint, what should we be looking forward to? This 2015, we have a new mayor, Mayor Muriel Bowser. I've heard that that you got to meet her when City Council honored you, but I was wondering if you and her have had a chance, or anybody from your team and her team have had a chance to talk and make some plans for this winter.
Well, we haven't had any chances to do that yet. I've actually met her a bunch of different times when she was on the council for 7.5 years. She knows who I am, and I also got to speak to her for a couple of minutes at Miriam's Kitchen, place that serves the homeless. She went down there for a photo op / press conference on December 29th. And I got to speak to her then. I'll speak to her again this coming Thursday. There's a WIN meeting. That is the Washington Interfaith Network. It's a collaboration of about 50 different churches who do grassroots advocacy work. Mm-hmm. And they'll be meeting at St. Augustine Church at 15th and V Northwest. So it's right around the corner from the Reeves building. And that'll be at 7 p.m. And I'll be there, and Wynn will ask her some questions and get her to commit to some different promises. And Wynn has said in the past that they're going to go back and confront the politicians if they don't follow through on their promises. Well, let's see if they do that. Let's hope.
Right.
Yes, and so I will get that chance, and I will also be in her office within a few days to arrange for a meeting.
Okay.
Yes, and so, but I should say also that something that has been working, that's had limited success, mm-hmm. is the Permanent Supportive Housing Program. Okay. And that's a program that houses disabled homeless people, mentally and physically disabled. And for what it's worth, it is working. It is getting people housed. However, it's not housing people at a faster rate than they're becoming homeless. So I'm glad that the most vulnerable are being helped, but then we have to find a way to get ahead of the ball and to actually house people more quickly than they become homeless. And that kind of leads into what I think should be done, because, well, first of all, I should say that when the government begins these programs, the funding is not guaranteed, and so every year you have to go down and fight again to get these programs funded. So it was actually Adrian Fenty, 2 mayors back, who began permanent supportive housing. It was due to a federal initiative, so I don't want to give him too much credit, but the feds put forth an initiative, and then Fenty grabbed it and began PSH. And then Gray actually decreased the funding, and then we didn't have as many people getting housed, and now our number of homeless folk is going up. But what I would say is this, is that we have to also give some attention to those who can work, the able-bodied homeless, or we call mm-hmm. them ABODs for short, mm-hmm. Because we have many people who are able to work and who just need a little help getting started, right? And they're just kind of lingering in shelter, and yet by the time we help them, they'll be retirement age, and they won't be able to work. Right.
And I'm glad that you're bringing up the ABODs, because it's such a, I think, like, some of the things that maybe some of our audience takes for granted is just showing up for a job interview and being able to leave like not having to bring all your possessions with you to a job interview so that, you can show this potential employer that, you're the right person for the job and, that you've got what it takes, but at the same time not having to worry about the security of your belongings. It's things like that. Things I think, being like even like interview training and preparation, and just getting connected to those opportunities. They're just such basic needs when it comes to people wanting to work, like you're describing, but facing some obstacles on the way to employment. Do you mind elaborating a little bit more?
Sure. There's this classic story that I love to throw around because it really drives the point home. There was a woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, I guess it's a couple years ago now, who had become homeless. She'd been homeless for 3 months, so she was not like this long-term homeless person, and she'd been looking for work. And finally, she got an interview at Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so then she shows up for her first day of work, and it turns out her employer had found out between the interview date and her first day of work that she was homeless. So when she showed up, he turned her around and he told her, "Don't come back until you have a home, and your own home and your own transportation." And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. How do you get your own home and your own transportation if you don't have a job?
Right.
And so she actually made it through the interview process, got the job, and then got turned away because she was homeless.
Right.
And that really makes the point about how a lot of employers just don't want to hire homeless people, and so it's a catch-22. You're homeless because you don't have a job. Now you can't get a job because you're homeless, and there are homeless people who before Obama phones, that they had to give the shelter number as their contact when looking for a job because they had no cell phone, and then what would happen is that the shelter employee was trained to answer the phone by saying, "Hello, such and such shelter, how can I help you?" And as soon as the employer heard that it was a shelter,
it's a giveaway.
Yes, he would withdraw the job offer. And so, I think that you actually lose your right to call somebody a lazy bum if you won't let them work and you won't offer them a job. And here in D.C., we actually had another classic case of it where in like February of 2013, there was an article in the paper about how D.C. government was going to shut down a successful job training program. It was a pilot program for TANF families, those on temporary assistance for needy families.
Right.
And 11 people were involved in the pilot, all homeless parents. 10 of them were on track to succeed. They were still in the program. And one had had a stroke and couldn't work anymore. And they were working on 2 vacant buildings here in Southeast D.C. on Wayne Place. And the government said that they just couldn't continue it. And they spent $6,000 training each person. They weren't complaining about that. They spent $500 on tools for each person. They weren't complaining about that. But it cost $2.6 million to renovate the 2 buildings, which in D.C. standards is not a lot of money.
Right.
But then they were taking the money from the Department of Human Services and from the Department of Employment Services. And for them, that was a lot of money. Normally, that money would come from economic development. And so you take the money from the wrong part of the budget, and then those departments say we can't foot the bill for renovating 2 buildings because we're human services and we're employment services and we're not economic development.
Right.
And then the government shuts down a successful program where all 11 people wanted to work and were doing well until the one had a stroke. And then it gets even crazier because 2 months later, in April of 2013, then Deputy Mayor of Health and Human Services, Bibi Otero, issued a statement where she strongly implied that homeless parents were just kind of lazy and shiftless and just didn't want to work.
Oh,
and that they just wanted to be somewhere where they can get free rent and free food and free transit. And this is the same government that 2 months earlier was saying we're going to shut down this successful job training program because we just can't foot the bill.
Right.
So how do you jump from one to the other so quickly?
Right. I mean, I'm glad that you're sharing this with us because these are, just examples of the most, basics when it comes to, you hear people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and, these are the most concrete examples that we can get, and yet, and we're living in a city that's supposed to be the right political climate for for addressing some of these kinds of challenges. So I guess looking forward in 2015, what would be your advice to people who are listening to the show right now, folks who are trying to figure who have heard a lot of what you've shared with us and are really interested in like moving the ball forward? What's your advice? Like, what's like the next best thing that they can do, and what's the follow up after that?
Okay, well, my focus for this year and even for the last part of last year is all around homeless employment, because I should say that it will really challenge the city. See, because the city officials, at least in the previous administration, will put forth this message, of homeless people being lazy. And so let's do different things to help get homeless people connected to jobs, and you'll see that many of them do want to work, and some of them, about half of them actually work at least part-time, some full-time, and so people need work boots. They need help with transit, getting to work. It's very hard to get transit support, for when you're looking for a job and you need to go around to all these different interviews. There are nonprofits that will help you with transit fare for your first 2 weeks of work. But what about the interview process?
Right.
And so we need help in those kinds of ways. We need spaces for people to meet in order to talk through that there are different issues related to work and finding work. Some kind of employment support group. Need a place where they can meet. We need food for those meetings, because a lot of times people have to forgo eating at the free soup kitchens in order to attend meetings that are going to help them improve their lives.
Right.
So you have to make tough choices oftentimes between going to work and going to shelter. If you go to work, you lose your shelter bed in some cases.
Right.
If you go to work, you miss out on the free food. And if you don't have enough money to buy food on you right at that time, then I've actually worked 8 hours in 95-degree weather when I lived in Florida, because I didn't have any money, to buy lunch. And that's not easy.
Yeah.
And so there are various ways in which we can support the homeless. And I would say that an idea I've been tossing around for a few years now is the idea of a website where people can go on and say, I'm going to donate this much to the homeless at this location on this day, whether it's food or it's work boots, because I've seen where, like, on one particular Palm Sunday, I ate 2 plates at a place called Martha's Table on 14th and V.
Mm-hmm.
I walked down a mile to Franklin Park, and within 2 hours, 6 groups were feeding. And after about the 4th group, I was like, look, stop feeding me. I'm full. I can't eat anymore. But that kind of made me think that if we had a website where people could say what they're going to donate,
right,
then once this location gets saturated with food, you can donate transit fare and work boots and haircuts and various things that people need to get to work. And then of course
right,
we have to have that website where people can go and look and see what's going on. Otherwise you're just running around town hoping
right,
that homeless people will be in this or that location.
Right. And and I think that this kind of help, the kind of help that you're talking about, is really to help our fellow Americans not have to face these false choices of, do you eat or do you work? Do you work or do you lose your, your shelter? I mean, these are just simply the kinds of choices that, citizens of the richest country in the world should not be, forced to make.
Right.
And, and I'm really grateful for your, insight and for, coming on the show and describing some of this. I understand that you're also a part-time journalist, that you're a correspondent in your own right. Mm-hmm. Where can our audience continue to follow your voice, your work, and continue to be part of your efforts?
Well, you can find out anything you want about me, right down to my shoe size, by Googling my name, Eric, that's E-R-I-C. The last name is Sheptock, S-H-E-P-T-O-C-K. If you get it wrong, Google will actually autocomplete it for you because they're so familiar with me. So it's Eric Sheptock on my Facebook page. I have a blog which you can reach by going to ericsheptock.com. and you just put in Eric Sheptalk in Google, and everything about me will come up, including every video of me, and everything that I've written, and various articles that I've been interviewed for by the Washington Post and other media outlets.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Eric. We really appreciate your time. We're going to have links to Eric Sheptalk's blog and Facebook page on our Facebook page. So look forward to a whole bunch of new audience members trying to help you out with your amazing work. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And you guys have been listening to Dr. America, and we will be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back. You're listening to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. And today's episode, we have been focusing on homelessness in America and in D.C. And, one of the things that this issue really forces me to confront personally is my own, I guess you could call it discomfort with charity. It's not to say that I don't think that, charity works. I feel like actually charity does a tremendous amount. I myself have been part of, a lot of, charity efforts. If it wasn't for charitable organizations, I probably wouldn't have had my opportunities to work with struggling families when I was a pre-med student, and then again when I was a medical student. I'm grateful to charitable organizations, and I believe in a lot of their missions. I guess the reason why maybe I get a little bit uncomfortable with charity is that for a lot of Americans, it seems like that is the beginning and end of their advocacy and activism when it comes to tackling problems such as homelessness, hunger, poverty. We find a charitable organization, we make a donation, and we feel like that's the only part that we have to play. And while I do feel that those contributions are extremely valuable, I would actually feel that we would be doing a lot of those organizations a disservice, and maybe we would even be, falling short on those missions if we didn't actually look at some of the problems of homelessness, hunger, and poverty from another vantage point, and that is not necessarily as a charitable donor, but as an engaged citizen. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think I know that not everybody who donates to charity thinks like this, but one of the things that I get concerned about is when we look at charity and whether it actually, the giving to charity, whether it reinforces or condones contempt in some kind of way. Our guest Eric Sheptalk, one of the things that he mentioned that kind of had some sting to it was that he was describing families who had and individuals who were doing their best to work, who were doing their best to break their back and be part of the American economy, an economy that wasn't always there for them to contribute. And he mentioned that he was saying that you lose your right to call someone a bum if you are going to be, on the one hand, offering them a job, but then denying them that job after you find out that they're homeless. He was saying that somebody who does that loses their right to call someone a bum. I actually don't believe that you've ever had that right. I do not believe that anybody in America has the right to lay that kind of judgment on another person. I understand where Eric was coming from in making his point, but I actually kind of wonder whether, the other flip side, the darker side of making it in America is that as you climb the echelons of the economy, that you get to look down on those who have not. And whether, that now breeds contempt, whether that breeds this notion that I am up here because I have worked hard and because I am good, and you are down there because you are in some way or the other not good. But lucky for me, and and maybe lucky for you, I will give you this donation out of my charitable heart. And like I was saying before, this is clearly not everybody who gives to charity, but I wonder whether this is sort of the defense mechanism that comes in with some of our least engaged citizens, and maybe with some of our worst players in the system, and that is like the super wealthy. You look at the Koch brothers, you look at the Waltons, and they immediately point to, the number of institutions that they have donated to, the amount of charity that they have done, and somehow we absolve them of their contributions to the problem because we think that they have contributed so much to the solution. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I look at the Waltons, this is one of the wealthiest families in America. They own Walmart, and they basically are, employing Americans at a significant rate, but none of them are really employing Americans well enough that they can keep food on their table or a roof above their head. And at which point it really does kind of, beg the question, why didn't your charity start at in your business model? Why didn't your kindness and your compassion start at your own workplace? Long before you sought to have your name on a theater building or as part of some kind of museum exhibit. Why didn't it occur to you to put some of this money and put some of this effort to perhaps less glorious tasks at hand, such as giving your employees a living wage job? Because I feel like these are the kinds of tough questions that we seem to excuse the Koch brothers, and we excuse the Waltons, and we excuse that echelon of the giving class, so to speak. We excuse them from having to answer some of these tough questions because, we find ourselves, for some reason, moved by their donations to charity, when in fact they could have been far more charitable and far more compassionate in their business models and in the way that they employ everyday Americans. So I hope that kind of explains why, I have a sore spot with charity. I don't think I don't mean to discourage anybody who is listening to this and is a regular donor to a program or to an agency or to an organization that is doing tremendous work. Please keep giving. I do believe that these organizations are part of our solutions. It's just that I by having this part of the conversation, I'm hoping that we can introduce another element, and that is to ask whether charity is really enough when some of us are capable of so much more. And so I guess that's one of my discomforts with charity on the socioeconomic and inequality level. And another arena, I guess, where I become uncomfortable with charity is simply that it's not sustainable. I mean, if you look at any of these issues like homelessness or hunger in America, we find that our food pantries, our homeless shelters are overwhelmed. I mean, they just as Eric was telling us, the disabled are becoming homeless faster than we can find homes for them. And and so a lot of charitable organizations are involved with helping these individuals and families in need, but it's simply not a sustainable solution. That cannot be all of what we do to take care of our fellow Americans in need. And what I hope we can move towards is actually looking at them as fellow Americans. I keep using that phrase throughout this program and through a lot of other episodes because I really want to change the paradigm from these people, whether these people are homeless individuals, are hungry children, or are people just struggling. I I want to really, redirect our focus and realign our focus to thinking of them as our fellow Americans, and to actually kind of ask ourselves, what do we owe each other as a society? What is our civic duty to each other? And from that civic duty, how do we become more engaged to address these problems? Because many of our fellow Americans, we're not that far away from their circumstances. Some of it is bad luck, bad bad programming and wiring in our biology, or just misfortunes and mistakes that were made. But nobody should have to suffer for any of that. And by looking at each other as our fellow Americans, I think that we can actually, find the right attitude for progress to be made. And this is not that foreign of a concept. This is the mentality. This is the culture that brought us Social Security. It was average Americans who looked at the elderly poor and realized that one day I will be old. And especially during that time in the 1930s, it was very easy for people to realize that anyone can be poor. It's that misfortune can strike anyone. But that misfortune and aging are not reasons why any of us should be destitute. And out of that attitude, that willingness to put compassion to work and look at each other as fellow Americans, a program like Social Security was implemented. And then the follow-up to that was Medicare. And now you look at the rate of elderly poor in this country, and it's still unacceptably high, but it is nowhere near as high as where it was at this point in the last century. And so this is the power of people with a new focus, with a focus that looks at poverty, that looks at homelessness, and doesn't think of, that doesn't look in judgment, that doesn't see these people and then assesses whether they are deserving of charity, but really looks at them as fellow Americans, who have every right to dignity in whatever shape that takes: housing, healthcare, food. And I hope that that this realignment of focus will help us in 2015. I feel like there's a lot of work to be done. But hopefully, looking at each other as fellow Americans will give us the right attitude and perspective and approach to taking us to where we need to be. You've been listening to Dr. America. I'm your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and we'll be right back after these messages.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back. This is the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thank you for coming back and joining us again. For this segment of the show, I wanted to do a special focus on children when it comes to homelessness and the impact of homelessness on our youngest fellow Americans. And so to help us with this part of the conversation, I am very pleased to introduce you guys to one of my colleagues, Dr. Ankur Shah. Dr. Shah and I work together here in Southeast Washington, D.C. He is originally from Arkansas and received his undergraduate and medical school degrees from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. His first work with homelessness was actually in the international arena, and he helped provide medical care to children trafficked along the border between Burma and Thailand. He came back to the United States, received a master's degree in public health also at Emory, and then moved to D.C. to further his pediatric training. Since he's been here, he's seen how children in D.C. face similar obstacles to children overseas, and those problems include homelessness, poverty, and safety. and a lot of those problems are things that children see overseas, and they're things that our kids in America unfortunately also experience. Dr. Shah's main focus here in DC is to treat patients and address their underlying social determinants of health. Thank you, Dr. Shah, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Ankur, I understand that you recently wrote a fascinating op-ed piece in the Washington Post about DC's homelessness crisis, and we're going to have a link to that article on our Facebook and Twitter pages. But do you mind telling us, like how that article came about, like why you wrote it and what you wrote about?
For sure, and for most of the things that I do and see, it all starts with the patient. Just in our clinic, as you well know, we have so many children and families that battle with homelessness and transitional housing, and it really affects their health. It makes them a higher risk for severe health problems as well. And just by seeing these patients over and over again, I was thinking, what is the district doing? And it seems like there's these chronic problems that we have in DC that just aren't getting fixed. And in my op-ed, I basically paint a picture showing that this winter seems to have all the ingredients to make it the worst yet for homelessness. This includes our general DC general shelter, that is a shelter for most of the families in DC, which was a previous hospital, is really decrepit, kind of running down, and it doesn't have enough space for all the homeless families that we have here in DC. We're expected a 16% increase this year.
Right, and my understanding about DC General was that it has fewer rooms than it used to have because of problems with dilapidation. Is that right?
Yes, that's completely true. So they're poor rooms, but now there's less functioning rooms as well because of a new D.C. Superior Court ruling that states that every family should have a private room, and those don't meet the specifications according to the law. But that is generally a good thing as well, just because there's a lot of safety issues that occur in a lot of these shelters.
Do you mind elaborating on some of those safety issues?
For sure. I think the most heartbreaking case, and that kind of riveted our whole D.C. community, is that's been kind of published and chronicled throughout the Washington Post as well, is the sad case of Relisha Rudd,
right,
who was, her and her mother were in D.C. General, and basically due to lack of supervision and trusting the wrong people, she ended up going missing, as well as the janitor there. And it was just later found that she's been missing for so long and never found. And it's just lack of safety and lack of proper supervision. And it's what always happens in these scenarios is the most vulnerable suffer.
Right. And how old was Relisha when she went missing?
I believe she was 8 years old.
8 years old, and from what I understand, the most recent news that we have is that she is still, her whereabouts are still unknown, and they have not found any kind of evidence of where she might be.
No, that's completely right. We have no idea. We always hope for the best, but we fear that the worst has happened.
Right. I mean, and I think to kind of put this grim picture into kind of a concerning bit of context here, I just wanted to share some facts from the National Center on Family Homelessness about children. They're twice as likely to go hungry. They're more likely to have severe health problems and less access to medical and dental care to address those problems. They suffer at 3 times the rate of emotional and behavioral problems like anxiety, depression, sleep problems, and then all of this ends up having an impact on their education, obviously, because they're more than twice as likely as other kids to repeat a school grade or be expelled or to drop out. And I was wondering, kind of using your public health background and perspective, what does this, suppose, we're looking at children with dealing with homelessness. How does this impact their trajectory for long-term health?
Oh, it's most of what children go through throughout their life are just building blocks for their adult health, and that's true of all children. So because of all the facts you've mentioned, they have higher risk for severe health problems, higher psychological problems later down the road, as well as emotional problems, as well as physical abuse. To kind of piggyback what you said, 34% of adolescents actually that are in shelters receive a diploma or a GED. So all those factors make them more likely to have longer-term health problems such as diabetes, hypertension, but also be more victims of domestic, emotional, physical abuse. And it's almost kind of like a cycle. There are independent predictors of homelessness of adults, and those are adolescents that have poor family relationships, school adjustment problems, or victimization, and history of foster care. So it's almost, we need to try to break this cycle, and we have to try to basically break it upstream, try to find these children early, find these families early, and make sure they have the resources that these children then can grow and become, kind of reach their potential. And that's, what me and you that's our goals.
Right. And kind of bringing it to the clinical realm. I was wondering if offhand, if you have any experiences from your clinical work that you're at liberty to share with us, and just to kind of give us some perspective on the potential that you were talking about, that's out there, and where maybe there are opportunities to turn these stories around.
I definitely think because we're painting a grim picture, but there's so much potential and room for improvement that seems kind of fairly easy. So just taking a clinical perspective, I have recently had a child around 6 years of age who came in for a normal sick visit. So as you know, in busy clinical practices, I think she had an ear infection. That would, in a normal situation, probably take 10 minutes, and it's a pretty straightforward diagnosis and treatment. However, one thing that we all could do to help these families, because they don't come to the clinic as often as they might need to because of all their other issues, is optimizing these small sick visits. So at this visit, we were able to catch up on her vaccines, provide her all this other care, and using yourself as an advocate to know kind of what resources are in the community. These children should have access to Medicaid. These families should have access to TANF, SNAP, WIC benefits, and really kind of optimizing those different ancillary services while they're here for any service. You have them, you have your family right there, and doing your best to try to make sure you could get all those needs addressed as well.
Right. And, I think one of the issues that our previous guest, Eric Sheptuck, brought up, because he's been homeless himself, and he is currently helping our homeless families in D.C. with his advocacy. He was pointing out that we unfortunately trap families into these catch-22s where, on the one hand, they want to work and they're applying for jobs, but then they're also, being denied jobs because they lack a permanent address. Are these similar kind of problems happening in a lot of the other agencies, like the ones that you listed, with WIC and Medicaid?
That is actually the number one reason why there's difficult to get Medicaid access. And it's not only in D.C. This is well documented across the United States that pediatricians should advocate for improving Medicaid access when there's not a permanent address. It's a hindrance, but nowhere does it say that you cannot have Medicaid if you don't have a permanent address. So it's an obstacle that we must overcome, but that is definitely an obstacle that we see. And just to kind of put it in perspective, before I started working with these families and reading about it, I never realized how prevalent homelessness with children are. The latest study shows that 2.5 million children in the United States are homeless. That's about 1 in 30 children. So if you just think about the sheer number of families that are going through this is, again, the urgency of the issue is now.
Right, absolutely, absolutely, and I was wondering if over the course of your research for writing that op-ed for the Washington Post, were there any glimmers of hope from a citywide policy standpoint? Did you see like any improvements that have been done recently or that might be coming up?
Yes, I think so. I think there's such a great potential to improve the current system we have, and it's all about having these plans and seeing, and if there are problems that do occur, kind of making game time changes. But some of the things that we're doing, so specifically, we have a new mayor, Muriel Bowser, and part of her campaign throughout election season was focusing on the underserved, focusing on poverty, and a all-ward type of strategy, so focusing on underserved wards as well, which I think is just a great kind of predisposition to have walking into it. But other things that our DC agencies are doing is improving what they call, quote, the exit rate. So the idea is, these families shouldn't be in a shelter for too long, and they're trying to optimize social services, so access to social work, access to job training, access to other housing where you work with landlords about maybe you don't have to, having rent reduction and things like that to help them get into stable housing, which I think is really good. And then the whole idea about DC General is not the appropriate place. It's decrepit. There have been articles about this in the Washington Post almost every year, dating back 5 years, so it's nothing new that has been heard. But the idea of maybe creating smaller shelters throughout the city that can be more intimate and spread across. However, there just have been neighborhood resistance to that idea.
And actually, do you mind elaborate? You mentioned that kind of resistance in your op-ed. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what's the resistance.
So I think the idea is to have smaller shelters throughout the city. However, you have to have neighborhood buy-in to have a shelter in your ward or in your neighborhood, and just those local communities across the city feel that will bring crime, or they just have this poor connotation of having a homeless shelter in their community. However, I completely disagree with that kind of idea or connotation because the facts don't bear it out. Around where DC General is, there isn't increased crime around that area. There are other homeless shelters, for example, near Columbia Heights and different parts of DC, and people don't even know they exist. They don't see a difference in kind of crime or anything. It's just a prejudice
right,
that we're doing that isn't bore out by the facts. And I hope a campaign to kind of educate the community and see what the facts bear out, maybe they could be more accepting.
Yeah, so, well, Ankur, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. I think you've given us a lot to think about. There's definitely room to put some spring back into our social safety net so that families can bounce back from the hard times that they've fallen on. But I think the tougher work, just as you had mentioned, is really for each of us to kind of look within and open our neighborhoods to families that are not really all that different from yours and mine, that maybe fell on some hard times and are just looking to be part of the American community and American dream again.
I completely agree. We're all in this together. And the only way we're going to solve this is together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Shaw. We will be posting your article on our Facebook page so that our audience can read it and learn more. You've been listening to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and we will be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and this brings us to the end of another episode in the new year. I want to thank you guys for joining us for this important discussion about homelessness in America. If anybody in DC, if you are interested in helping a homeless family that you see out in the cold, please feel free to call the hotline number. The shelter hotline number is 1-800-535-7252. Again, that's 1-800-535-7252, or you can call 202-399-7093. Again, that's 202-399-7093. And I want to thank my guests, Dr. Ankur Shah and Eric Sheptak, for coming on the show and sharing their insights into homelessness in America, a problem on which we can do better, we must do better. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next week, salud to your health.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
If you believe in God, then intellectually you cannot believe in man-made global warming.
Today is the one-year anniversary of ClimateGate, and we discovered that they artificially altered the science to hype global warming, which I say and others doesn't exist.
Not about climate change, not about polar bears, not about any of that. This is about a concerted global effort to reduce the standard of living of all Americans. Bring us down so the rest of these countries can float up. And that is what this is about.
Attach this to the global warming agenda, and they have. It's called the polar vortex. The dreaded polar vortex. Do you know what the polar vortex is? Have you ever heard of it? Well, they just created it for this week.
When are scientists